It's with great pleasure I welcome back Anders Puck Nielsen, military analyst and influential YouTuber based in Denmark. He specializes in naval warfare and strategy. He has one of the most extraordinary YouTube channels where he publishes deep, I would say, analysis and opinion on what is happening in the war. And it certainly is one of the few English language channels I would actually watch with any regularity. Anders, welcome back. Oh, and you have a book as well. We have to mention your book too. I'm looking around. I should be able to find a copy of it somewhere, but if you don't, maybe you can show one up to the
I
camera.
think I have one here, but thanks for mentioning. Here you go. Thank you.
There we go. Fantastic. Logic War in English, available from good booksellers, or if not good booksellers, then Amazon. Yeah, no, that's definitely worth reading. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me again. Always a pleasure.
Oh, always a pleasure and a privilege. And of course, we're at an interesting phase of the war here, having had a number of recent trips and indeed been in Ukraine to witness the change in pattern of attack. I'm I don't want to put my interpretation fully on this because I'm actually not sure what I think. But is this change in ballistic strategy where they don't have an air alert, ballistic come in, the first thing here is an explosion, that the pattern of attack has changed. They seem to be stockpiling these ballistics and then expending them on big raids, terror raids, I think, and really the mechanics of these raids designed for terror. What's your interpretation? Does this come from desperation? Does it come from a belief that actually Ukrainians will still buckle to terror and somehow just give up under the weight of this? Is it simply vengeful? Are there any strategic outputs? Or is Russia simply doing this because Western allies have not provided the interceptors to prevent it?
I think it's a bit of both or a bit of all. At one point, it's simply a reaction to the fact that Ukraine is now pushing more on Russia, and the Russians don't really seem to have much of an answer to it, right? So what do? Well, you double down on the things that you can do, and I think it's going to be a pattern that continues. That the bigger the stalemate is, the harder it is for the Russians to make any progress on the front line. The more they're going to focus on these deep strikes with missiles, drones, and of course the developments in tactics and technology continue. So we see different kinds of drones now. They're faster, they're more difficult to intercept, but also the ballistic missiles. That the Russians keep developing there and making it harder and harder to intercept these, trying to expand their ability to launch bigger and bigger attacks. And I think that's going to continue because really it's kind of difficult to see what else that they would be doing if they can't deliver the results on the front line. Well, at least they can bombard the rest of Ukraine. And I think also it ties into a kind of theory of victory here, right? That Putin really seems to believe that this kind of putting pressure on the civilian population in Ukraine will eventually lead them to start demanding from their government that you got to make these Russian attacks stop, whatever way. So stop being so stubborn about whatever, keeping the territory or not making concessions. Just make these attacks stop, whatever. Right? That's the idea that Putin seems to believe that this is the reaction he's going to get in Ukraine, and I think that's a miscalculation. I think Putin has pretty much gotten the mood of the Ukrainian people wrong the entire war, right? And that's still the case. But it means that he will keep on focusing on just making these attacks worse and worse, and that's probably going to be defining much of the phase of the war that we are in right now. That it is this kind of duel between two sides that really strike each other with the long range strikes, and um, it's going to be worse and worse until one of the sides can't keep up anymore. It's weird because on the one side it's a result of Ukraine actually having success on the front line and making it really very difficult for the Russians to advance there, but still it does make things harder for civilians.
This is an interesting phrase, theory of victory, because it seems throughout this war, Western allies have neither had nor sought a theory of victory. They just seem to want it to stop without realizing that things don't magically stop by themselves. When you're dealing with a dictator, I think these historic lessons have been forgotten and not internalized. But this is an interesting point because the West has got, I mean, I think the collective West has broadly got everything wrong about Russia, everything wrong, and continues to do so. They presume that when Russia is struck harder, that when things like wildberries are struck, that somehow there'll be a rally round the flag, that Russians will behave like people in the West would, they'll be incensed, they'll rally with their government, and we'll have this surge of nationalism. None of that happens, and I think you and I can attest that Russians do not exist that way. That's not how the state and the psychology is constructed. We continue to get that wrong. We now are perhaps in a phase where we see Russia not making progress and losing, and we presume that that understanding is there in the system and in the hierarchy. But I think that might be a false assumption. So Ukraine has just started, in the absence of a Western theory of victory, to create its own. And they actually started to articulate that, and we can see the outlines of what that might look like. And they've even started talking about, yes, we have a theory of victory. Does Putin have a theory of victory? And actually, if he does, should we not be terrified by that? Because his theory of victory might involve some steps which we are not predicting or preparing for.
Um, I mean, he definitely had a theory of victory, right? He had this idea of how he was going to achieve what he wanted, and then that didn't quite work out. But I think fundamentally, I don't think it's changed all that much. His view on Russia, on Ukraine, it's based on deep assumptions that Putin has about the role of Russia in the world as a great power, the role of Ukraine as a small state on the border of this great power, right? And how Putin sees the relationship there and how things ought to be, and also the fact that Putin doesn't really believe in Ukrainian nationhood, right? He doesn't really get the idea that Ukrainians actually are separate from being Russians. So he believes that it's this kind of misunderstanding that Ukrainians have, and that it's kind of you can brush it away, right? And beneath that, it's essentially the same historic roots and the same nation underneath. And so he has these kinds of fundamental assumptions about how Ukraine works, and he believes that he can sort of brush aside this wave of Ukrainian, say, nationalism, or this pro-European movement in Ukraine, and there is a basis for a pro-Russian one instead. And I think this vision of victory, he can bully the Ukrainians into accepting this future together with Russia. And then his vision of victory vis-a-vis the West is that he's just going to outlast us. And he did not expect the West to last as long as it did. Um, he fully expected the West to give up within a couple of months, right? As we saw in 2014 with Crimea, and just accept the new geopolitical realities, as the Russians like to talk about it. So the determination of the Western countries to keep supporting Ukraine and keep also taking the blows that it gave to our economy, for example, especially in the beginning, right? Where we had to get off much of the Russian gas and find alternatives, and it did create an economic crisis of sorts in 2022, right? But there was still the determination in especially Europe to actually stand through this. And but I think fundamentally it didn't really change his calculation that he is going to be able to outlast the West. It just changed his perspective on how long time this will take, right? And well, with the United States, I think the fact that Donald Trump came in, that pretty much put an end to American assistance to Ukraine, right? This is something that would embolden Putin, that would confirm his view that, well, he can just outlast these Western countries. And then he's super annoyed, of course, that the Europeans keep on doing this because it makes things harder for him. But ultimately, in the end, that the strategy is still the same, right? It's still about just wait until something happens and the Europeans lose determination. And so I think we should pretty much just expect the Russians to keep the same strategy and trying to do whatever they can to put more pressure on Europe. And but ultimately, it's not that Putin has some great plan of how what he does now is going to lead to victory. It's more about how what he does now is going to allow him to continue maintaining this pressure until something happens and the problem magically goes away.
So we got some magical thinking on both sides, it seems, there in terms of the end game. He also may well not be in touch with his own internal, let's say, capability. I'm not gonna try and frame this in political sense and confuse it with how a Western audience or public would behave, because we don't see those mechanics happening. But it brings to mind the line of Borma Harris that the Nazis started carpet bombing British cities under the delusion that they would not be bombed back. And it seems that Putin is now suffering from that same delusion. We can deliver pain, misery, torment, and death to Ukrainians, and nothing bad will happen to us. And it seems that that view is also internalized amongst many Russians who now look at these burning warehouses. Now, obviously, the people who understand what's going on are not going to record silly TikTok videos. But those who do are rather entertaining. They're like, why is this happening to us? What have we ever done to anybody? And it just seems that they're rooting around for the most convoluted explanations simply to avoid the simplest one, the very simplest one. And some of them may be genuinely confused. And I think part of this may be because they do not see Ukraine as sovereign. They do not see Ukrainians as the talented, capable people that they are. And they're just not, they're used to punching people and not being punched back. I mean, it may be even as simple as that. What are your thoughts on all of that? It's not really a question. It's just a splurge of statements I'm throwing in your direction.
Yeah, it is amusing to watch these Russians who really don't get it and who are confused about why is this happening, or how would anyone do these things, right? Because if you've been following what Russia has done in Ukraine, then like it shouldn't be surprising that at some point Ukrainians are going to start hitting back. And expand the sort of the scope of targets they will hit inside of Russia. So we've seen a lot Ukraine going a lot after oil infrastructure and trying to bring up gas prices in Russia. But the next step is going to be these kind of logistics chains, by now going after wild berries. And um, but I think fundamentally the issue here is also that if you expect that all these Russians are now suddenly going to turn against Putin, and that these attacks on something like the warehouses, and that ordinary Russians feel the hardship that is going in itself to lead to change in Russia, I think you are mistaken. I think that's an overly optimistic view. I don't think that's really going to be the case, right? It might be it might assist in the kind of early stages of some politicization, but these are clearly people who have not been following politics and who don't really see themselves as having a political role. So we should not expect these people who are totally confused about why would anyone attack us? What have we ever done? Right? To next step to go out and say, well, clearly it's about Putin and we need to replace him. Right? There is a long way to go before things like that happen. I might be overusing the word phase here, but it's the beginning of a new, I'm going to use it anyways, a new phase in the war where ordinary Russians will feel the consequences of the war more and more. And the illusion that Putin was able to uphold for about 4 years, right, to ordinary Russians that things are all right and this is not, it doesn't really impact us, that now we are entering a new phase where Putin increasingly will have to deal with the problems of how to manage the fact that ordinary Russians actually do feel this, and it will be interesting to see how he will go about doing that. But I don't see it in the short term leading to a termination of the war. I don't think Putin particularly cares about the suffering of ordinary people, right? This is a short term regime security problem for him that he needs to manage. But in his mind, this is just a kind of temporary kind of phase, and he's dealing in history, right? He's making history here. He's thinking in centuries, right? And this is a historic journey. It's much bigger than whatever suffering there is right now, because some Russian lost their business because there was fire in a warehouse, right? It's not really his, like, who cares about that fire in a warehouse in 100 years, right? And that's the kind of history Putin thinks in, right? So he doesn't really care about this. So it's not going to lead to him changing his view on Russia's destiny or what's necessary in that sense. And it's also not immediately going to lead to particular protests in Russia, because it's going to take a lot more. And fundamentally, what's missing in Russia right now is also an alternative, right? There is the collective action problem here. Well, it would take something for people to mobilize about an alternative to Putin, and that alternative is just not there yet.
And of course, Putin has removed all the alternatives. He's made sure there are no rivals and no talented people left on the political scene. This, I think, is the fundamental issue that you've put your finger on here. It's the one that many Western analysts and politicians don't want to face, because it leads to some very difficult, let's say, strategic thinking. On the one hand, and this is something that, and I interviewed him almost a year and a half ago, Alexander Nevzorov told me. He said, "Look, this only ends when someone puts a bullet in Putin's forehead. It's as simple as that. But if no one is prepared to stand up and do that, and the broad public don't yet associate their pain and individual problems with Putin, or even if they do, it's sort of subconscious and they know they can't articulate it, then we have a problem here. Putin continues, and this only ends when Putin's dead. This is the conundrum, which means that we need to maybe stop focusing on Russia, which of course everyone loves to do, and actually focus on Ukraine winning. Then maybe that's the only thing we should be really focusing on, not fictitious negotiations, this, that, and the other, just accepting this core reality that Russia will not stop. Therefore, you just have to focus on beating it and beating it and beating it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are two ways that it could stop. One is that Putin dies, and Putin is mortal. So I guess that's also a kind of just waited out kind of strategy. And
That's not a strategy though, is it?
it's just,
Waiting for your opponent to snuff it, you know.
yeah, yeah. I mean, but I mean, that's one way. Another way is to focus on the capabilities, right, and making sure that the Russia gets degraded to the point where Putin is unable to continue the war. And I think that's the more realistic path forward here. But we're far away from that. I mean, you just started the interview by talking about the Russian strikes on Ukraine right now, and it's important that people don't misunderstand the messages that come out, yeah, and read too much optimism for Ukraine into the fact that Russia is struggling on the front line and Ukraine is starting to hit Russia's rear, but also to understand that Russia is by far not defeated, right? Russia still has magnificent power. The Russian military is still mighty, and I think if things continue the way they do, I think the trajectory is that Ukraine is on the path to victory. But I mean, if something happens, which is what Putin hopes for, right? Some unexpected event shows up, somehow the Western countries lose determination to keep supporting Ukraine, then Russia can still win, right? So I think it's important to keep focusing on that. But it is possible to degrade Russia to the point where it's just not going to be possible for Putin to keep fighting. And um, I think, unfortunately, that's what needs to happen because he's not going to stop before he's unable to stop. But we need to separate those two things about intentions and capabilities. This classic sort of military distinction.
Is that the strategy that's unfolding? Because it seems that Crimea is less and less viable, certainly as a civilian area, and it's becoming less viable and certainly less advantageous as a military territory as the logistics are treated, air defense, etc., and the airfields and so on become exposed. And then we have the attacks on Wildberries, which, yes, this is a psychological operation. Let's not pretend there is a psychological operation against the mass of Russian people who are, either indifferent to the war or really not doing anything to stop it. But there is a military logistics component to that. It's similar to. There's a reason why Novopochta is being hit in Ukraine by Russia. Of course, one reason, again, is the civilian reason. They just want to destroy nice things and good things that Ukrainians have. But also, it's a critical node in the military logistics chain. Let's not pretend it isn't. And Wildberries fulfills a similar function. So, by taking these warehouses out, and let's presume that actually all the major warehousing facilities are about to burn in the next month because there's no way they can protect them, does that have a material impact on how Putin can execute the war?
I think all of these things, Crimea, Wildberries, the oil infrastructure, all these things, it's about consuming resources. It's about limiting the resources that Russia has for the war fighting. And it's not going to be one thing that suddenly means that the Russians won't be able to do it anymore, but put together all these things that's a resource drain, right? And it's going to make it more and more difficult to uphold the pressure. Um, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are still ways that, I mean, the Russians under pressure, they are pretty good at finding solutions to these kinds of things. They are going to find workarounds. They're going to, and it's going to be more time consuming. So it's the same thing with the sanctions, right? People have said, well, the sanctions don't work because Russia is going to be able to find it through a chain of middlemen and they're still going to be able to get these components. Well, that's true, but it's a lot more difficult and it's driving up the costs. So it means that the Russians can afford fewer components, right? Because it's essentially the same kind of thing here. I think the Russians are still going to be able to find ways to bring things to the front line, but it's a lot more difficult if you have to have your own logistics that you need to somehow keep secret than it is to just send something with wildberries. So um, all these things play together in pulling resources away from the main war fighting effort. But ultimately, I think what it will take before the realization really starts sinking in Moscow that they are actually losing the war is not going to be enough to just hit these warehouses and things like that. But I think it's going to take for Ukraine to start taking back territory, right? That is going to be undeniable. That is going to be a sign that the moment that Putin is unable to actually keep the territories that Russia has taken so far, that is going to put a different kind of pressure on him because that will be the point at which it's becoming evident that he does not have the resources to continue this war, and that's when we might see things start happening in terms of him actually trying to find a way to end it.
And of course, he's not going to stop trying to gain advantage. Now, his prime motive, of course, is regime survival and individual survival. I think that is quite clear. But if he still has a theory of victory or a theory that he can outlast his opponents, he may be looking at this and saying, okay, well, what is the real problem here? He may not credit Ukraine with the, let's say, the sovereignty and the agency they actually have. So he's likely to look at this and say, well, the Americans aren't really doing an awful lot. It's the Europeans, right? How do I make the Europeans stop? And of course, it seems that many analysts and many armchair analysts, go on ad nauseum about the Narva scenario and blah, 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 and taking the Baltics. That doesn't seem to me necessarily the most likely scenario. But is Putin going to be actively thinking about how can I prevent Europe from, or stop them from doing what they're doing? How can I deter them and degrade them, or even get them to fight amongst themselves? Might he not be planning some provocations in order to drive a wedge there? And as he sees, it weakens Ukraine. I don't think it necessarily will, but what are you seeing here?
I think it's definitely something that we should not be surprised if he does that. And obviously, someone in Moscow is thinking about it. The fundamental problem, if I can use the word center of gravity here, then for the center of gravity that Russia really needs to target in order to win the war in Ukraine would be European support to Ukraine, right? The moment the the Europeans stop providing, especially financial aid, but pretty much all kinds of support to Ukraine, then Russia would be able to win pretty quickly, right? So somehow he needs to address that, but of course, from the Russian perspective, there is also the danger that this could backfire. It could have the opposite effect. It could actually lead to the Europeans doubling down on supporting Ukraine, for example, if something like that happens. It could lead to remobilizing the Americans for supporting Ukraine, right? It's not evident that this would be a good way to go for them. It would be a high risk daring thing to do for the Russians. I think we should expect Putin to try to do that before accepting defeat. We need to acknowledge that he would probably rather escalate his way out of the problems he's in than acknowledging that he lost the war. Definitely we need to look at that. And there are many different scenarios. There are many ways that this could happen. It could be the Baltic scenario. It could be something maritime. I would not be totally surprised about that. There are many different ways, but I think what I would say is that for it to work, I think it has to be something that is above the threshold of being hybrid. I think it's pretty clear that Russia's hybrid war on Western Europe has not worked. So it's got to be something more than that if Putin really wants to challenge that. For the moment, I think he actually hopes that this Iran thing that's going on, that this is going to be what will ultimately lead the Europeans to understand that this is too expensive. So I think he's hoping for some kind of global recession as a result of that. This will maybe give Russia some oil revenue, but also it would, it could be what would lead the Europeans to understand that we got to end this war and give in to what Russia demands.
It's interesting because, of course, we're ignoring China in all of this. And it does seem that several things behind the scenes are going on. One is China is not giving the unlimited support that the rhetoric suggests. Siberian pipeline's not going ahead. China seems to be squeezing Russia for every ruble, not really acting necessarily as a partner, but as a almost, it'd be like one of these uh, people who pulls the debt at an extremely high rate. They're like almost like a loan shark. They are helping with components and so on, but it also seems, from what I can tell, that the influence in Central Asia and certain parts of what would have been Russia's imperial hinterland, China is moving in and actually forcing out the operations of Russian intelligence on the territories that it would naturally consider its imperial territories. We're talking about Central Asia, especially here. So there's some really interesting things going on behind the scenes. China wouldn't necessarily be that, let's say, on board for Russia's strategy to crash the global economy. That would be extremely hurtful for China. So I wonder whether Putin is restricted in this sense, dependent on China, but not necessarily aligned with China in terms of their end goals.
That's true. And I think the whole idea that there would be an alliance between Russia and China and also Iran, I think it's a working relationship, right? Sometimes they have shared interests, as other times they don't. And um, so you're right to say that China's support for Russia has not been as great or unlimited as Putin had hoped or thought. I also think it's clear that, well, this war that Putin is waging is essentially turning Russia into a kind of vassal of China, right? Which is kind of ironic because it was about restoring Russia as a great power, but instead he's made Russia so dependent on this other great power. But I will also say that I think uh, it's uh, it's in Putin's mind. He's grown up in this Cold War era, and in Putin's mind, the greatest enemy against Russia is the West. It's Western Europe. It's the United States, and China is a different kind of challenge that he will need to deal with that at a later point, right? That could wait because the big threat, the big sort of historic competition is with the West. Um, and I don't think that a different Russian leader might not look at it the same. They might have different ideas about it, especially if they're from a younger generation, right? They would be concerned about what we see from China, but and what this will do to Russia in the long term. But I think for now, Putin is just pretty much willing to do whatever because in his mind, the important fight is on the Western Front.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And you've been very vocal, actually. I tend to agree with this, and this is something that many Ukrainians actually will talk about, not necessarily in public, because it's a tricky one. And that is that one scenario, when Putin has exhausted all the others, one scenario is to freeze the conflict. And of course, we know from, if we observe, Minsk 1 through 3, etc., a frozen conflict with Russia is not frozen. There will be provocations, artillery strikes, terrorism. There'll be all sorts of stuff, attempts to destabilize internal politics, corruption. All of these measures will be escalating in the context of a frozen conflict. So, in some ways, it may not be in Ukraine's interests to achieve that, frozen borders without any sort of strings attached. That could actually place Ukraine in a very weak position. And many, I think, especially of those who are serving and at command level, seem to feel this very acutely in Ukraine, which is their best hope is to carry on and comprehensively beat Russia. Otherwise, I think their sovereignty and security might be seriously tested by the so-called frozen conflict scenario. But how does this all play out in your mind?
I agree that would be a big challenge for Ukraine. How would you actually deal with it if suddenly the Russians start being forthcoming about, well, okay, let's try this ceasefire thing. Let's stop all the long range strikes, right? For example, because that without that, when like what's left of Ukraine's strategies, and it's not a whole lot, right? If you can't actually go after Russian logistics, and if Ukraine has to stop hitting Russian oil infrastructure, the warehouses, all these kinds of things, have to stop hitting Crimea. Um, so I think that is a big challenge, and it's something that we might see Putin also going that way at some point if he's really forced into it. If we get to the point where, for example, Russia is unable to hold on to the territory that they've occupied and they start losing it, we might see Putin suddenly coming up with ideas like that. And I think the big concern would be that um, Western support for Ukraine might actually drain out very quickly in that scenario. Discussions are going to come into instead for focusing on, well, how is Ukraine going to meet all the demands of being a member of the European Union, for example? What about your tax regulation? How are you going to focus on blah, 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 all kinds of things? And what are you going to contribute to Europe, right? Instead of how we can keep supporting Ukraine. Um, I think many people in Western Europe or the United States are going to be convinced that this was it, right? That this was kind of solved, and they're not going to be focusing on how do we prevent a new Russian invasion in a couple of years, right? So I think that's one of the problematic things about that kind of scenario. Of course, it will not actually lead to Russia winning in the short term either, but it might be something that Putin could also try. So we have a whole spectrum of different things that Putin could do, ranging from attacking the Baltic states to him offering a ceasefire, right? Or going along with that. Another question that we are going to come up against, or that I think we're sort of approaching the point where it becomes relevant, is how long is Ukraine's offer of a ceasefire actually going to be on the table, right? It's on the table right now, but as you say, it's not necessarily advantageous for Ukraine with ceasefire if things start going Ukraine's way, right? Why would, if Ukraine really suddenly starts taking back territory, why would they want to stop, right? Um, so we might actually see at some point the Ukrainians start taking that offer off the table. But how is that going to be perceived in Western Europe? Is are countries in Western Europe going to be supportive of that move, or is that going to create friction? Because some people will say, well, Ukraine is obviously not seeking peace either right now. We need to terminate the war. We shouldn't continue it, right? Are countries in Western Europe going to be supportive of the mission of actually for Ukraine to win the war and get out of this in the best possible condition? Or some countries going to just say, nah, we just want the war to end, right? We just want it to stop. And so that's another dilemma that I think is coming up.
Stop the killing, which those of the horseshoe theory on the left and the right have used this phrase. I think you would see that coming out of a lot more people's mouths, unfortunately. But those who understand it would almost certainly want Ukraine to have territorial integrity, because that is a barrier, or at least a better defensive, both physical and psychological barrier against renewed Russian attacks. But one of the things that has enabled Ukraine to do this, of course, is the evolution of drone warfare, and it's happening at an absolutely sort of furious pace. And they're innovating the mechanisms, not just the technology and the supply lines, but the mechanisms of how you create and sustain and accelerate this ecosystem. The Brave One marketplace, the gamification to an extent of this, the introduction of certain sort of, I would say, sort of, capitalist rules into the military at every level. It seems that we are still very, very far away from developing this ecosystem ourselves. So we may in the West be able to create some of the supply chains that feed that. But it seems that we have not, in any sense, really understood or internalized or recreated the ecosystem that drives this technological change and innovation. Does that not mean that Ukraine is not just a net provider of security to Europe, but actually is a fundamental part of the defensive ecosystem now? And without Ukraine, we would be extremely vulnerable to Russia and others.
Hmm. Absolutely. Ukraine has become this very, very important sort of brick in the whole defense of Europe, and that's not just because they are right now fighting the Russians, but it's also because they are the defense industrial powerhouse right now. That's where things are happening, the innovation, the production, right? Things scale quickly, and that is going to be vital for European security also going forward. And I think increasingly we see Zelensky also appearing with this sort of self-confidence that he knows that it's not just him going around, asking contributions from other people, right? It's also him actually having something to offer so it's more transactional in that way. And I think that's also been one of the reasons why Ukraine has been able to, maintain the level of support that they have. In the beginning, right after the full-scale invasion, it was very much driven by sort of moral outrage about, well, this is just wrong that Russia is attacking this country and it shouldn't be allowed to continue. So we should support Ukraine for moral reasons. But increasingly, it's also just a transactional thing. Well, we need to support Ukraine for our own security. And I think that realization has sort of dawned on European politicians, broadly speaking. So we are definitely going to see Ukraine play that role also going forward. And I think it's going to be, let me put it this way. I think it's going to be a long way before the European NATO allies would be able to defend all of NATO territory without the United States. I don't think the European states would be able to guarantee the territorial integrity of the countries bordering Russia. But with Ukraine's help, they might, right? So I think it's important that we also understand that Ukraine really has the military power to play this role, and that we need it. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's definitely that's definitely something that plays a role also in why Ukraine can feel kind of confident that they can take further steps and not lose the support of other countries. Yeah.
Well, here's the last one, and this is just, I think this is probably going to be a relatively short one, but I want you to sort of leave on this note because I think this is incredibly important to understand, and it's another one of these Western assumptions that perhaps isn't correct. The war may end with Putin's death. And one would hope that we don't just rely on him to sort of croak naturally, that someone accelerates that to a particular point and that it's intentional. I think it's probably important that he dies for a reason at someone's hand and that it is linked to his culpability for the war. The assumption, of course, is in many minds that the war ends and the intent to try to control and dominate Ukraine ends with it. Unfortunately, I don't think that's correct as well. There are many people in Putin's regime, many people in the Russian public who see it as the natural order for Russia to dominate Ukraine and for it to be something the order of either a vassal state or worse than that, simply a sort of puppet territory. What's your view on that, and how can we really educate people to the idea that actually this imperialist mentality is not just confined to Putin and will remain a problem even after a Ukrainian victory?
Well, why do you think it's important that Putin dies for a reason? Let me start by asking you a question here, because
Yeah,
I would think that if Putin just dies for natural reasons as well, then there will be someone else taking the position, and they might look at things differently, not necessarily in the goals, but in the way that things are playing out, and see that this is not really a viable path to
they
continue on.
might. They might, but they also might not feel the consequence of the mistake. And they might assign it to other things other than Ukrainian strength. They might just assign it to magical forces. So I think it's very important to make that sort of causal link between here is a geopolitical decision and the consequences of it were the weakening of Russia and the death of its leader. I think that causal link is more powerful. It's made in people's minds. That doesn't guarantee that the next ruler of Russia won't repeat the same mistakes. And it doesn't guarantee that the next ruler of Russia won't look at it and say, well, this was a mistake and move on. I mean, none of these things are guaranteed. But I think making that causal link is important, and not just for a sense of justice, just to build this idea politically of cause and effect. Because I think, as you mentioned earlier, this is something that's curiously lacking in the majority of the Russian population, the idea that there are consequences to actions. And I think that's an important foundation for the future.
I think if we look at history and how empires sort of uh, got over their desire to dominate other countries, I think one of the primary ways that empires have learned that has been by losing wars, right? So losing wars can do magic to the, the sort of self-image that countries have. And I think there are cases where this has happened through the death of a leader. I think Germany, Italy in 1945, good examples of that. But I think it's not necessarily been the case that the leader had to go. Right? I don't think any particular leader in Britain, for example, lost their life, and that led to sort of Britain learning that we're not a global empire anymore.
You have to go
I
back to the Civil War, and that's a very different scenario. Someone who divided the country and caused untold suffering and death gets the head lobbed off. But that's different, and people put different interpretations on that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think fundamentally what I'd say is that there are two ways that this can play out for Russia if we look at a defeat, right? It can be a kind of soft defeat where ultimately the Russians are not forced to face these kinds of questions, right? They don't have to go through the kind of process of sort of national reflection that you can say that Germany, for example, went through after the Second World War. So if this is a kind of soft defeat where they just kind of they just have to give up this thing because things didn't play out the way, but ultimately Russians are going to be able to go home and continue life, and then this undercurrent, this imperial sort of mindset is still going to exist in many uh, places in Russia. People are still going to feel that Russia's rightful place is to dominate its neighbors, and that it's a kind of divine mission, right, to bring greatness to Russia. And I think that will be the case if this does not end in a really resounding defeat, right, where the Putin regime falls and Russia is thrown into to chaos and kind of regime change, and it's going to be very dramatic. And I don't think that it will necessarily end that way. Uh, and in that case, what we will need to do from a European perspective is basically then we're back to military deterrence being the safeguards against a new Russian aggression, and that can also be okay. I mean that's not necessarily. I mean that is a pretty sort of classical way of dealing with an imperial neighbor, right? To just build your military so that you can actually withstand that. And we have experience in how to build alliances that can do that and how that would work. It will require a new European-based alliance that can deter Russia from aggression in the future. But it would mean that ultimately we have to understand that still in Russian society there will be this desire to recreate the empire. Um, and I I don't know. It might also lead to the kind of defeat that you're talking about, where the leader is you know um, goes away as a result of something happening here, and it leads to a bigger such a tragic end of the war that is something that's going to leave scars in Russian sort of national understanding, the national identity for generations to come, as we've seen with Germany, for example. And that can lead to kind of transformation. But I, I guess the more likely scenario is that we're going to end in the first one, where it's a kind of soft defeat, where Russia doesn't necessarily have to go through this process of reflection and um, you know, finding a new national identity.
And it suggests in that case they remain a threat, and the threat of every generation, the threat of aggression doesn't go away as well because the ambitions don't go away. So it seems that what we're doing will remain important, I think, in that respect, to try to make sure people don't let Russia off the hook as we did in the 1990s and disarm ourselves both mentally and physically. That is something that cannot and should not happen this time. Anders, thanks so much for coming back on. Always a thrill. I think this was certainly one of my favorite conversations and at a critical time as well.
Well, again, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Khartiia is a Ukrainian corps operating around Kupiansk, which is a critical area of the front. Now, this campaign won't be for everybody. It is a kinetic campaign in that we are crowdsourcing here for funds to buy vampire drones. 15, in fact. 5 of those have already been achieved in this campaign, but we are looking to scale this up to get the full amount of $40,000 US, that's going to Dzyga's Paw that are handling this. This is an incredibly important campaign. There are many creators who are taking part in this. My view is that it's not enough at this point just to help Ukraine to survive. It's not enough just to invest in humanitarian causes. Not everyone's going to be comfortable with this, but they have to remove the invaders from their lands. To do that, they need the skills, the munitions, the weaponry to achieve that. This is where these vampire drones come in. So please, this isn't a full polished promo. I'm still working on that, but the campaign launches today. Please do check it out and, of course, help in any way that you can.